Hi, I'm Kristen and this is Scrap Fabric Love, and today we are making No Measure Improv Flying Geese. So I'm going to show you two methods, one for using up little triangle offcuts that you already have, that maybe you just don't have anything to do with, large or small, and another method if your scraps are more like this, more like a square or larger. If you don't know what a flying goose is, it's a traditional quilting block that's used as the building block for lots of different quilt blocks. I like to stack them like this. They tend to be twice as wide as they are tall. They don't always have all this extra background fabric around them. I'll show you a photo on the screen of maybe a more traditionally pieced flying goose if you haven't seen it. And there are tons of tutorials out there for how to make them to precise measurements and so many at a time and all this kind of stuff. But if you're new to the channel, I make scrap quilts here. I don't follow a lot of quilting rules. And if I can ever avoid measuring and cutting ahead of time, I do. So this is what this method is for. So we're gonna start with your little triangles. I'll show you that method first, and then I'll show you the other one. So some of you may remember this bag. It's a bunch of K facet scraps that I got in a haul a really long time ago. And I used some of them in another quilt that I've shown on the channel. But what I have that I want to use today is all these triangles. So these were already cut into triangles in the bag. So some of them are like that kind of size, and some of them are much tinier. Where's one like that? Okay, and you might have little offcuts like this from other projects. So that's the idea with this. Obviously, if you want to follow along and you don't have little triangles, you can just randomly cut triangles from smaller scraps that you have. But this is what I'm trying to use today. So for this method, as well as some random triangles, I also have some random strips. I'm using grays for my background. I'm using a range of widths of strips. I'm not measuring. I'm just doing a kind of eyeball guesstimating thing. Generally speaking, the larger the triangle, the wider the strip, because the wider the strip is, the more clearance you're going to have either side of your triangle goose thing for background fabric. So you're not cutting off points and things like that. But you can have a play with different width strips and see what you like. But any kind of strip. And it doesn't have to be this long, but I want to do a bunch at a time. So if you had just like a little piece that was, say, that long, you could still use that. But I'm using strips because I want to use up more of these triangles all at once. And I want to make this improv project a little bit quicker. If you don't have strips, but you do have larger triangles in a contrasting color that you're happy to use for your background fabric, that would work great as well. And in fact, I'm going to use a bit of larger triangles for some of my background later on after I've done some of my initial trimming. So I'll come back to that. Triangles I'm using today as the basis of my flying geese were offcuts from somebody else's project, right? So even though I have two sizes of them, they're all pretty uniform and pretty kind of like evenly cut. But if you've got triangles that are a little bit different, have different angles, you can still use those. It doesn't matter if they're not the kind of triangles you normally see in flying geese. Okay, so here's what I'm doing. I've got a sewing machine, obviously, got my cutting mat, I've got my rotary cutter, I've got my ruler. You do not need to use a ruler for improv, but I do. So when I say improv, I mean no measuring, no planning. I don't mean everything has to be completely at odd angles all the time. I don't mind if it is, but my main goal for doing it this way is not to have to pre-plan anything. Okay, so I am gonna start with one of the skinnier strips here. So I've got one strip, this one's hard to tell because it's a light gray, but anyway, it's right side up. So what we're gonna do is start with a strip, and we're gonna chain piece triangles to it, right sides together, and I'm going to leave a little gap, okay, about a finger or two. So I'm lining up one short side of each triangle, right sides together on my strip. If you're not using, equally sized triangles like this, then just choose whatever side you want. Don't worry about that. And the reason for the finger spaces is so that we have enough clearance of background fabric when we come to trim these units apart. So these dashed lines are where I would cut with my rotary cutter, and I would end up with something like this with a little bit of strip hanging off the bottom of the triangle. And then I would add another piece of fabric that I also want to hang off the other side of the triangle so that when I trim the bottom, I still have background fabric either side of my triangle. Otherwise, I'm going to end up with something that looks a little more like this, which is a little harder to work with. But if we've left ourselves enough clearance, we can have fun with trimming, we can have fun with wider or thinner strips that we're using, and maybe angle our cuts and just have fun with it and have plenty of space around those triangles. If you're someone who likes batch sewing, this kind of chain piecing of the triangles to the strips can go really quickly, and you can get a whole bunch of these done at once. So when would you want to use wider strips? Well, probably when your triangles are wider, okay? You can always add more strips, more things if you find yourself, you use something too small. So I'll show you that as well. But that's the basic rule of thumb, is if you're using a slightly wider triangle, like say this one, then maybe you want to use a wider strip, because then, especially if you want it to be a wider geese, whatever it is you want. So for this one here, I would trim once it's joined along there, do you see? And here, once there's some fabric over here. So I could even have a huge background over here. Like if I just wanted a little floating goose for some reason, you know, but maybe you don't need quite that much and you want, so maybe you might want a strip that's more kind of like that, right? And then it would be there, and you would just have this little bit, and you'd have your sort of twice as wide as tall kind of idea. So it depends entirely on the look you're going for, but that experiment with different width strips and see what you like, basically, is the message there. And what if you don't have thick strips? You could always do thin ones, and then with the idea of coming back and adding another one, all you want to do in that case is make sure that you've got enough coming off this end so that when you cut it off, here's my ruler again, you've got some it's coming down to the same level where the end of your triangle is, right? If you did it up here, then you'd have to add here as well. You have to add on all sorts of sides. So you just want this to be long enough. Okay, so here are all my chain pieced triangles, right? And so what I'm gonna do, before I even press them, I'm gonna trim these apart. I suppose you could iron first if you prefer, but anyway, this is how I do it. And so I'm just gonna fold it open and trim along this line, because this is the line I'm gonna add the next bit of fabric for. So I want it to be straight. Again, you could angle if you're a total improv person. I still like some straight lines. I just don't want to measure or plan what size the block's gonna turn out in the end. We all have different things about improv or making it up as we go along that we like, and this is what I like. Once I get to the last one, what I'm going to do is flip it around. So I might have a tail that I could use for something else, and trim along this long edge, right? So I save that. So I've trimmed all these units apart. I go ahead and give them all a press before I add the next strip of fabric. So here I am with my trimmed triangles with one bit of background. And then I'm going to take a strip, let me just move these, sorry, and put it on this one, right? And then I got to decide kind of where do I want to put it. This one's got funny angles. How much do I want to save? So I could sew it here, for example, and I would, if I trimmed it here, so let's call that the bottom, that's fine. But that's a whole lot of, do I want this much space up at the top here? Because that's where I could trim it there. Maybe I do, maybe I don't, you know? You kind of decide what you want to do. Or you could decide to put it, say, down here, so that you've still got your 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch, whatever you're comfortable with at the top. And then you cut off more here down at the bottom. Or maybe there's space for another triangle, something like that. Okay, so it's not like a big science. It's just, you want to make sure you've got enough clearance at the top. So the place you wouldn't want to put it is like here, right? So you do that. Then once you've sewn it, in order to make this a straight line, you've got to cut it here. And then your 1/4 inch is going to cut off the point. Like, that's not crucial for everyone, but like if you're trying to make a no measure flying geese that doesn't cut off the points, you're just going to want to shimmy that up at least a bit. So you just decide where you want to put that second bit of fabric. The other thing you'll get the hang of guessing and guesstimating if you make a lot of these is that the more clearance you give yourself when you're trimming above the point of that triangle, the less background fabric you'll have either side of the triangle. So you see, if you lower that line, then you can also move the side cuts out wider and have more background to either side. So all of this is just personal style choices, but it's just something to have in the back of your head. And then I'm just going to chain piece them all. And if you're starting with your triangle round this way, remember to leave a little space at the top of your strip so that you equally have that background fabric when you go to trim. And keep leaving yourself those finger spaces as you chain piece for the same reason. And if you're having fun just piecing triangles to strips and then you get to this point of adding that second bit of fabric, you might find that you come across a unit where maybe the strip that you joined the triangle to is ridiculously long and you know you're not going to want that much space at the top of the triangle, at the top of your point, right? So then this is what I do. I would trim the bottom the way I would if I was trimming the unit generally. And then I will rotate it and find a straight edge on the side. So I'm basically cutting off triangles. So I've cut one off that side and then I'm going to rotate it around, make sure I'm leaving myself at least a 1/4 inch, but I usually leave myself more like a 1/2 or an inch sometimes at the top of my triangle, and then trim off that excess. And I can use those triangles later on to do other sides of other units. And then I just keep chain piecing. Okay, so I've been cutting off these triangles with the bigger strips, right? And that seems like, ugh, what am I going to do with those? But you can use them for other geese. See, so now I can decide if I put it here, right? You see, I might lose this point. I've got tons of space up here, but I could shimmy it down there. And that's perfect, right? So then I go and trim here and here and there. And that, I kind of like how that looks. Do you know what I mean? Or you could even do it a little lower if you want. Do you know? So we can use these triangles. So even though we're not planning ahead and maybe it felt like we were using a strip that was too wide and oh no, now we have all these offcuts, you can use them different places, okay? And even some of them, like the small ones, maybe we start some new flying geese with them, you know? And we just keep going. We're forever making flying geese. It's an option. If you're someone who is used to cutting everything precisely before you make a quilt unit, this might seem like unnecessary work. But this is where this whole thing that I try and talk about on the channel comes in, where it's like different things for different sewers. So for me, this is much less work than having to calculate and cut a whole bunch at once and figure out. I would much rather do my problem solving on the fly. This is way more fun for me. But different folk are going to find different things fun, and that's okay. When I come to trim these units apart, I start with the bottom sort of unsewn edge of the triangle, and I do just a straight line to cut those apart. And then I'll press them, and then I will come back and do my other trimming. If you end up with a strip where you've just sewn the triangles in the other direction, and it doesn't make sense to trim along the bottom and you're trimming along the top, just keep in mind the seam allowance you're going to want at the top of your point. So have a think about whether you want to leave just like that traditional 1/4 inch or a 1/2 or even more, and that's just a style choice. And once the units are all pressed, we get to have fun trimming them up and making them look more like flying geese. So I'm going to start with the long bottom edge because there's only a tiny bit to trim there. And then I'm happy with this side. So I just have to decide how much space I want above. I'm good with that. I kind of like that. So I'm going to trim this off. So this is my little bit of trimmings. It can go in my little container where I turn it into cushion stuffing. And this can go back in the pile of triangles that I could use to make another flying goose or whatever. And then if I wanted to make it equidistant, I could see how much this was and give it to on this side. I usually don't do that. I'll just kind of eyeball what I like. I kind of like that. And again, I'll keep this for this offcut for something else. So there's one. Is it completely, rectangle, completely perfect? No, but I quite like it. And when we join them with others, you're going to see the variation can make it look fun. So let's do another one. So this one's a bit shorter on this side here. So I'm going to do this. Right. And then this, so I guess I'm giving myself about an inch above the point is generally what I seem to be doing, or a tiny bit more, which is probably more than you get on a standard flying goose, but anyway, I like that. And again, I'll keep this triangle that I can use. And now I just need to find where I can straighten up. So here, for example, I would cut off that point. So if I don't want to do that, I could add another strip here. And then I could move over a bit, do you see? And have a little bit of another fabric there. Or I could, because I didn't need that much space, I could trim it down here And then I can come over a bit further. So let me show you. Right, so let's say I only want a 1/2 inch above the point. Then I can trim here, and I've got a slight 1/4 inch there. Do you see? And I'll still be quite close to the point, but I won't have lost the point. So I'm gonna do that for this one. But if I come across another one, I'll show you just adding the strip and giving myself even more space on this side. Okay, so here's one where, you know, because I wasn't paying attention, my angles aren't quite right. Okay, so I've got my little space above. I could be slightly less, but even then, I think I would still be a bit short here. You can see how this angle doesn't quite work. So obviously I could add a piece here and here. That seems like a lot. So what I'm gonna do is this. So chop that all the way off. And then I'm gonna add something else. Let me find, like that. So that's the same fabric, or I could use a different one. Let's do that. So I'm gonna put that on, and then I'll iron it and come back and show you. Okay, so there I've added that extra bit. So now I can trim it straight at the bottom and keep that bit at the top if I want, which I do. And then just trim off this teeny little weird thing at the side. So now I've got this one, and it's got this extra bit of fabric. That could even be a different color. You could make it a design feature. Lots of stuff you could do with that. And if you want to make sure you're getting a square edge, you can line the top of what you're trimming on one line of the ruler, and then the bottom on another one. Just find any lines. And then you know when you trim that's a sort of a straight corner, you know? All right, so they can be kind of off center, kind of like that one. So I'll trim up the rest, and then I'll show you what it's like when I put a few of them together. Okay, so I've trimmed these all up. Got all of these. They're all different sizes. They've got different sorts of background on either side of them. All different. So I'm gonna find some of these that I like, that I want to put together. I'm gonna start with these 4 because they're all the same fabric in the triangle, right? But they're all different lengths and everything. This one's even got one of those extra strips, right? So now they're not all the same width, right? So now I've got options. I can decide I'm happy with this side. This is the shortest side here. And I will just join them and then trim them here. Or I could decide, no, I want it to be as big as the widest one. And then I would be adding little coping strips, you know, little bits of a strip or something on one side to make them bigger. I think I'm going to add a coping strip on this one. That's what I think I'm going to do. I think this is not working for me unless it's a little bit wider. Just this bottom one, I think. So I'm going to add this strip to this, and then I'll put these together. All right, now let's see. So now, if I line up sort of over here, I've got this bit that's going to get trimmed off and a few little bits over here. But if I go to where I would get a straight line with this, still this shortest one, I've still got some space up there. So I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do is put these 2 together first, and then these 2, and then I'll put them together. So I just happened to be putting these geese together into stacks of 4, but of course you can use these geese lots of different ways. You don't have to put them together in a larger unit like this. Okay, so press that, and now I'm going to trim. Okay, and obviously I can square up the top and bottom if I don't think that's entirely rectangular, but I think that's okay for now. And you can see, so these 2 are probably a more classic flying goose. We haven't lost our point, but it's very close to the seam. And these 2, there's quite a bit more space. So you can see how you can play with that, and they're obviously not one on top of each other. They're kind of scattered. I quite like that. I think that's fun. So anyway, there's one. So I'll show you a bunch more examples of these at the end, including these ones that I made with the teeny tiny triangle offcuts as well. But first, let me show you the quick 4 at a time improv no measure method when you don't have triangles that you're starting off with. This next method is if your scraps are not triangles, they're squares, say, right? Or square-ish, right? As well as your accent square, you need a slightly bigger background square. So it's going to be bigger. So we're going to have about a finger or so bigger. And that is so that when we sort of jiggle it and sew, we're going to make sure we've got that clearance over the point, even though we're doing these improv and they're not going to come out completely uniform. Right. So what we're going to do is put them right sides together, roughly in the middle, but it's not massively important. And I'm just showing you the two sizes because you can do it any size, right? That's the only reason for that. And then I'm going to cut diagonally, sort of in the middle, and here. And then I'm going to go and sew my 1/4 inch down each of these. Now, if you're used to, 4 at a time methods of things where you would say draw a line here and then stitch either side, you can do that too if you prefer. I'm doing it like this because it just feels faster to me to sort of load them up like this and then chain piece them through the machine rather than sort of turning them around. I'm going to have to cut them apart eventually, right? There's always 2 or 3 ways to get to the same place. So I'm going to stitch all of these 1/4 inch and then I will come back. Okay, so that's them stitched. I'm going to go and press. Okay, so here they are. So these are the bigger two. They look a bit funny with their little tails. And these are the smaller two. And then what we're going to do is, so you see where the print is here, we're going to have this print over here. So we've kind of rotated it. So we've kind of got these wings off in different directions, I guess, right? But what I don't want these seam lines to be, I don't want them nestled. Like, I don't want it like this. Okay, I want it with some space. That's going to be the space that saves our point, even though it's improv, right? So we'll do that. And then this one, same. What I want is some space in between these seams, ideally like a finger, something like that. If it's bigger, that's fine. And don't stress if it's less, but Okay, right. So I've got my strange little shapes and I'm going to cut them again this way. Okay, and then it's just the same. Again, I'm going to pile them up so I can chain piece them. And I'm going to sew the 1/4 inch down here. Okay, so here we are. I've done all that stitching. And so what I'm left with is that. You might be able to guess what we're going to do. But anyway, I'm going to press them and then I'll come back and show you. Okay, and so here they are. And what we're going to do is trim them apart. So all you want to do is find whichever point you want and make sure you've got your 1/4 inch, at least your 1/4 inch. And then guesstimate that you've got the same on the other side and then trim. And I'll trim the other side as well. Now what happened here, because, I was guesstimating the size of the background square, is that because of the way I'd shimmied them, one side of my triangle is going to get a little cut off, which is fine because it's improv and it's just going to look interesting anyway. But if you don't want that to happen, you could use a larger background square or play around with shimmying it in different directions, but still leaving that space in between your two seams so that you don't lose this point. Or you could decide you don't care about that part and you only care about this part, So there's different ways to do that. Right, so I'm just making sure I've got the clearance. The thing I don't want to do, ideally, is lose my tops. I don't really so much mind about the sides, personally. So now you would get something like this. So depending, which way you shimmy them, you could have them looking a little bit different. Kind of like that. And then these ones. So they obviously have that random, these two are over on this side, these two are over on this side. You could decide to have them going back and forth. That's kind of a cute look. I kind of like that. So I think I'll stitch mine together like that. There they are, stitched together. So obviously I've trimmed the sides so that they can kind of have something else added to them. If I wanted to put them together, for example, I might put a coping strip here to make them the same size. Or if I wanted them this way, I might put a coping strip on one side or the other, offset it, something like that, right? So these are all the flying geese that I made. You'll see some of them, like these, are not from that K-Facet bundle. They were from triangles that maybe were not as uniforms, but this is the same method that I used for the first one, the strips. I was just sort of strip piecing this with scraps. Same with this. These are really super teeny, weeny, tiny ones. And There's the purple, very teeny ones, and you can see they're much less uniform than when you started with triangles that were more of a similar size to each other. There's another one, and I had a little bundle of orange ones. I can't help myself color grouping scraps. I could have done these all random, obviously, but as you can see, I've kind of done them in little color groupings. And I also did a few with these kind of thin black strips, like the green triangle at the top here, kind of partially framed. If you like the look of those, I'll link in the description box to my framed scraps video, which gives you the basic idea of how you would do that. I'm thinking at some point, if I add more gray, negative space, then I could make a fun kind of just modern quilt with these improv flying geese, but I'm not sure exactly when I'll get around to that because I've got other projects at the moment, but I've had fun making these. It's definitely more usable units than just having those triangles in a bag, and I'll let you know when I turn these into something. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to be part of a Choose Your Own Adventure Flying Geese group quilt, we are doing that inside of Scrap Club now. We just launched it recently at the time of recording. So go ahead and check out the link in the video description box if you want to join Scrap Club and become part of our fun group quilt experience. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a part 2 and let you know what I end up doing with these flying geese in the end. I hope you have fun with it. Maybe use up some scraps that you didn't have a use for before, and just have fun playing in your sewing room. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel before, I hope you'll consider it, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Bye.